I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the diplomatic fallout between Paris and Kyiv and analyse the Russian oil price cap that comes into effect today. We also hear from our global health reporter, Harriet Barber, on sexual violence in Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 5th of December, day 285. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nichols, our Economics Editor Sue Chan, and our Assistant Foreign Editor Arthur Scott-Geddes, making his debut on the podcast. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi, David, and hello, everybody. Hello, Arthur. Okay, so the air raid alarms are going off as we speak in Kyiv. I've seen various reports of missiles that have been shot down and others that haven't. It's all completely spurious at the moment. We don't have any firm data. So as of going live now, just after 1300 GMT on Monday, this will be different obviously for the pod a bit later, but as of now, we do not know. So just be very, very careful of any information that you see claiming such and such has been shot down or X number of missiles have got through. We just do not know. But the air raid alarms are going. Now, this is something we've been expecting for a couple of weeks. In fact, Ukraine, the Ministry of Defence in Ukraine have been saying for a couple of weeks now that they have been expecting a very large wave of missile strikes again. We've seen this over the last few months. This is what the only thing Russia can do now, basically. They're going nowhere on the battlefield. Bit of skirmishing around Bakhmut in the centre. I say bit of skirmishing, it's extremely violent, but what I mean is the lines aren't moving much. But essentially Russia is not able to do anything on the battlefield. All they're able to do is try to terrorise the Ukrainian civilian population through these attacks on critical national infrastructure. So it looks like the wave of attacks which seem to be happening now are what Ukraine has been expecting for the last couple of weeks. Now, that might be separate to or related because of a couple of incidents this morning. Now, two Russian long-range aviation bases deep inside Russia, one only about 150 k's south of Moscow, the other one about 600 k's south of Moscow, but both a very, very long way away from Ukraine. Two Russian long-range aviation bases have been subject to some kind of violent attack. And again, you can tell I'm choosing my words very carefully here because on social media, people are saying it's drone strikes. It's a new drone that Ukraine have developed capable of 1,000 kilometers. It's this, it's that. Again, we do not know. All we do know is that Russian state news are saying that one of them was caused by a fuel truck that exploded and killed 3 people. So we know that that's not true. So it might be something else, but we do not know what. So firstly, let's have a look at these two bases. The first one is called, it's near the city of Ryazan, Dyagilevo Russian Air Base. Near Ryazan, about 150 k's southeast of Moscow. There was a blast this morning, Monday morning, which, like I say, Russian state news are saying a fuel tanker exploded, killing 3 and injuring 2. There's footage on social media of a very large explosion, but we don't know what it is. Now, separately, 600 k's southeast of Moscow, there's another base. Called Engels Air Base, 600 k's southeast of Moscow. That has been subject to a much larger blast. Again, you can see those on social media. Ukraine not claimed responsibility for either incident, but Engels houses the 121st Heavy Bomber Aviation Regiment, and Dyagilevo is a training centre and also houses Russia's only IL-78, that's the Ilyushin, big heavy Ilyushin tanker, air refuelling tanker base. Across both of them are the Tu-95s and the Tu-160 strategic bombers. Tu-95 we know better by the NATO code name of Bear. It's a large 4-engine propeller strategic bomber. It's old, first flown in 1952, but it's still there. It's been in service since 56. It's but a bit like the B-52, the US B-52, the airframe is old, but it's been upgraded. Even these old Russian planes have been upgraded over the years, so they're still very capable. And what they do is they're launching these. It's from these aircraft that the air-launched cruise missiles are being thrown at Ukraine. So. And the Tu-95, that's the bear. The Tu-160 is similar, but it's supersonic. It's a variable swept-wing heavy strategic bomber. Again, pretty old, back in the 1970s. But hey, just because you're born in the 1970s doesn't mean you're old. Stop it, Arthur. So they are the strategic bombing fleet across these sites. Now, there are other Russian airfields that can launch these big heavy bombers, but there's not many of them. There's only another 2 or 3 dotted around Russia. So if this is a strike, it is very significant. Now, that's what we know so far. I'm now going to move into a little bit of speculation and analysis. So what does this mean? I'm skeptical of some hitherto unseen, massively long-ranged drone. But yeah, entirely possible. If it is a drone, then that means that there will be hundreds of Russian bases, headquarters, logistic depots now in range of Ukraine, if it is indeed Ukraine, which we should assume it is. So what can Russia do about it? We know their air defence is not brilliant. They're kind of a little bit asleep on the watch. So they probably should have shot these things down. They've not been very good around Belgorod, which is a lot closer to Ukraine. So the expectation that Russian air defence hundreds of kilometres away from Ukraine will be in tippity tip top number one state of readiness is unlikely. However, these sites should have air defence around them. What might Russia do now? They might disperse the fleet to these other air bases, as I've described. We've seen them do that before. So where there was that the maritime drone, the uncrewed surface vessel, the maritime drone basically, that went into Sevastopol harbour, we know that Russia firstly upped their protection of the Black Sea Fleet and moved their Kilo class submarines out of there. So they are very, very quick to not accept the strategic risk. I mangled that sentence, but what I mean is that they're quick to move their very valuable assets away from the new threat. So maybe that they're going to do something here. Now, whether or not there are going to be more of these strikes, whether or not it was a drone strike, whether or not it was some SF team with a drone locally, we simply do not know. But that's almost not the point. Russia now have to take this into account in terms of how they affect their military posture. And also, these strikes are deep inside Russia. So this is going to play into the Russian social media channels. It's going to play into the civilian population. We know that the war is waning in popularity. So this is yet again showing the Russian civilian population that they're in a proper fight and not a special military operation. So maybe they don't need to do many more of these strikes, if any at all. There are reports that 2 of the Bears, the Tu-95s, were damaged. We've absolutely no idea. We can't verify that at all. But we know they've got many, many more aircraft and missiles. So actually, if that's what it's achieved, that's not a huge amount of actual damage, but that is not the point. Just being able to do it and being able to put that seed of doubt into your enemy's mind is a large part of these kind of strategic attacks. Now, as we say, there are air raids going off right now over Ukraine. About an hour ago, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense said that 14 Tu-95s had taken off from that base. Now, whether that was to disperse them or if that's part of the likely strikes that are ongoing right now, we do not know. Worth noting, of course, that in recent weeks, the number of cruise missile strikes and indeed drone attacks has dipped. That has gone hand in hand with the Ukrainian estimate of this long-anticipated big wave coming. It might indicate that Russia are, rather than trying to dribble out these attacks over a number of days, they're going for sort of the shock effect of it all happening in one day. We do know they're very low on their precision-guided munitions, so maybe that's why they're trying to save what stocks they have for these big sort of spectaculars. An awful lot of speculation there. as the day wears on, we will all get more information. But it does look like, just to wrap this bit up, other news later, but just to wrap this bit up, 2 airfields seem to have been subjected to some kind of attack deep inside Russia, and there are the air raid alarms are going off across Ukraine right now. But I better take a pause there.
Thank you very much for that, Dom. And as Dom said, a lot of this we'll have to try and verify over the next 24 hours. And I'm sure we'll bring you another update tomorrow on what we think is happening inside Russia and, of course, the result of these airstrikes on Ukraine, which are ongoing right now. Arthur Scott-Geddes, can I turn to you? Away from Ukraine, away from the war zone, there's been quite a few developments in the diplomatic sphere. Can we start with this? It's a huge diplomatic falling out, really, between Paris and Kyiv. What's happened?
Thanks, David. Yeah, so Emmanuel Macron he's again provoked outrage in Kyiv by saying Putin needs security guarantees from the West before any peace deal can be achieved. And these comments that he's made, they came after a state visit to the US where he dined on American cheese and lobsters with Joe Biden, who, of course, also said last week that he would be willing to sit down with Putin if he withdrew his troops from Ukraine. So Macron's again trying to sort of position himself as a potential peacemaker. But it's not the first time he's made himself unpopular with the Ukrainian leadership. At the beginning of the war, obviously, he was criticised for speaking with Putin on the phone as the invasion was underway. And then in May, Zelensky accused him of asking him to make territorial concessions so that Putin could save face, although, to be fair, the Elysee later denied this. And then more recently, he got in trouble for saying France wouldn't respond in kind if Russia launched a nuclear attack on Ukraine. But there are a few reasons why these sorts of comments, the security guarantees comments, provoke such a furious response from Kyiv. One, I think, is that it's come after, as we've already discussed, a wave of really devastating attacks on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, which have really made it very difficult for Kyiv to kind of even contemplate sitting down with Russia for any sort of negotiations. And then I think it's also significant that Macron kind of directly responded to the Kremlin's supposed fear of NATO expansion. Macron talks about the deployment of weapons that could threaten Russia, and describes NATO coming right up to Russia's doors, which sounds exactly like these are all kind of decades-old Kremlin lines that Putin and his allies, and as well as Russian and Soviet leaders before them, have been repeating for decades. Interestingly, though, if you go back and listen to Putin's big speech explaining his reasons for the war, he doesn't actually. I don't think he actually did mention NATO. So comments like this anger Ukraine because they kind of lend credibility to Russia's excuses for invading. And then finally, a third thing I think is that the prospect of any sort of security guarantees for Russia will have set off alarm bells in Kyiv. They'll be asking, what will that entail? And they've obviously launched down this path of closer alignment with the West, whether that's just the EU or NATO. And so they'll be very concerned that they'll have to abandon or walk back any of those plans. And then today, Germany's Olaf Scholz seems to have kind of echoed this kind of conciliatory tone that we've seen from Emmanuel Macron, although in a much more guarded way. He's written an opinion piece in Foreign Affairs today where he warns about a kind of return to the Cold War and warns against dividing the world into different blocs. It's in some ways it's unsurprising, I think, because the scars of the last time the world was divided in half are very much on show in Berlin. So I don't think it's that surprising that this is the era of history that he's chosen to invoke. But nevertheless, I do think it's kind of further evidence, isn't it, that some European leaders appear to be kind of softening their stance on negotiating an end to the war.
Well, thanks very much for that, Arthur. Just a couple more stories I'd quite like you to talk us through. There's a few stories from our Moscow desk that have come out over the weekend. One is on the effect of mobilisation on Russian plumbers, and the second is what's happening in Russia for New Year's Eve. Would you talk us through these stories?
Yes, so we had a couple of stories over the weekend from James Kilner, who listeners will remember from previous episodes. That kind of point to the further impact that the war is having, within Russia and on ordinary Russians. One was quite a surprising line, I guess, which was that even though it's Russia that's, bombarding Ukraine's energy infrastructure, leaving loads of the country without power and heating, many ordinary Russians are also facing a kind of bleak winter. And that's because the engineers who used to repair the kind of quite, the Soviet-era central heating systems that keep apartment complexes and whole towns warm, they've been mobilised and sent off to the front lines. So often these involve very large city power stations which kind of heat up water and then they pump this hot water around the cities, particularly Siberian cities and things like that, to stop them from completely freezing. Temperatures obviously regularly drop to 40 below in Siberia, so any disruption to these systems can actually be really dangerous. And then the New Year's Eve story is that several Russian regions have cancelled their New Year's Eve celebrations, like fireworks displays and that sort of thing, so that they can save the money to contribute to the war effort. It's kind of a strange parallel for the many kind of public fundraising efforts that we've seen spring up across Europe, to help Ukraine. But again, it's interesting because it shows that the war is having an impact on the lives of ordinary Russians. And this, would be another apparent breach of this kind of strange covenant that the Kremlin has kind of forged with the people that says, that Russia's leaders are given kind of free rein to do what they want on the international stage in exchange for stability and relative prosperity at home. And it also comes after, late last week there was a Kremlin survey that was leaked that showed support for the war had fallen among the Russian public.
Well, thank you very much for all of those updates, Arthur. Thank you very much for joining us. There's, of course, as you've touched on, a huge economic side to this. There's another really big thing that's happened today. The price cap on Russian oil agreed by the EU, G7 and Australia has come into force today, Monday, the 5th of December. It's fantastic to have our economics editor, Sue Chan, here to explain a little bit about what's going on. Sue, thank you so much for joining us. What's happening with this price cap?
Hi, David. Well, there's actually two things that happened today. But yes, as you mentioned, a price cap that has been agreed by the G7 plus Australia. So the G7 is the UK, so it's us, the US, Canada, Italy, Germany, France and Japan have agreed on a $60 per barrel limit on the price at which Russian oil can be traded outside the bloc. So bearing in mind today, I looked just before I entered this room, crude oil is currently traded at $87 a barrel on financial markets. So they're trying to cap it well below that price. And your next question is probably, well, how are they going to do that? Because when governments in general try to control prices, it usually ends badly. So they're not planning to flood the market with oil to try and increase supply to bring the price down. What they're doing is using an advantage they have, because most of the oil that is shipped around the world, it needs to be insured. So when I send something from A to B, because it's oil, some of it might fall off into the sea, you might lose some of it, or even worse, it might cause an environmental disaster if, say, there's an oil spillage. So you have to get that those containers insured. And the EU, mostly via Lloyd's of London in London, or there's a club that's based in London at least, does this insurance. And what it's saying is to these companies, and they're trying to stop shipping companies from handling Russian oil unless the price tag is $60 a barrel or below. So they're telling these companies that do these insurance contracts, the companies that ship this oil around the world, when this oil comes to you and the Russian company, etc., says, I want to send this to X country abroad, unless this oil is priced at $60 a barrel or below, you can't deal with it. And so that comes into effect today. Oil prices are up slightly off the back of it. It's too early to say what the immediate impact is. But, the idea is, since the start of the war, Western governments want to inflict maximum pain on Russia by hitting the Kremlin's wallet where it's hardest from oil revenues. But it also wants to minimise the hit to consumers. We've already seen here in the UK, our energy bills, we're all thinking twice, do we crank up the heating? Can we afford it? Energy bills have shot up here in the UK and across Europe. But so they want to minimise the hit to consumers. The price of inflicting maximum pain on Russia.
So do we think it's going to work? And when we were chatting before this, you mentioned that there might be some loopholes, there might be ways of getting around this. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, well, as with everything, a lot of this, when you have these international agreements, there's a lot of bargaining going on, a lot of horse trading. This $60 a barrel limit, this figure was come upon after months of negotiations. On the one hand, you have countries like Poland, Estonia, Lithuania saying, look, the price, it's too high. The cost of Russia getting out the ground, putting it in a barrel, sending it somewhere is about $20 a barrel. So Russia is still going to be making money out of this. And if the idea is to minimize the Kremlin's revenues from oil, it's doing that to some extent, but Russia is still making money. And because of the huge jump in the oil price this year, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, it's actually going to be making more money from oil this year than it did last year. But then on the other hand, you had countries in the EU like Malta, Cyprus, Greece. They have huge shipping industries saying, hey, this is a big part of our economy. You need to actually price it a little bit higher. It needs to be higher than $60 a barrel so that we don't get hurt disproportionately from this deal. So I think America played a big role in trying to broker this. They've come to this $60 per barrel limit. Again, this is the first day we've seen prices rise slightly. Russia, a spokesman today said, we will retaliate. They didn't specify how. I'm not sure how they would, but they also said that it wouldn't stop its military campaign either. In terms of loopholes, yeah, there are potentially a lot of loopholes. I mean, this is a supply chain. You have a Russian company, it comes out of Russia, it goes through a shipping company. They all have to certify what the price is. And there could be records, there's a risk that records could be falsified by Russia and trading partners who want to keep that oil flowing. The Kremlin said it won't sell to countries that comply with this price mechanism. So, there are potentially ways that countries could find ways around it. I was looking through the history books before I came and sat down here. A similar thing happened when the UN during the 1990s tried to do something, a similar plan in Iraq. There's this famous Oil for Food program, and lots of countries overpaid for other commodities such as wheat. The thing with money is that it's fungible. So you can say, yes, I'm paying this for wheat when I'm actually paying a little bit more for oil. And who can prove it? And it's very difficult. And also there's other countries involved. So as the EU has turned its back on Russian oil, Russia has tried to turn towards other countries, China, India. They've been able to pick up millions of barrels per day at a discount price. And if these countries can find insurers, and the EU is not the only EU companies are not the only companies that offer this insurance. If they can find other companies to insure them, they can snap up Russian oil at any price. So there are potential loopholes, and I think this regime, the policymakers who announced this said, we're going to tweak this, and we'll see how it goes. But it's day one, as you say.
Well, thank you so much for all of that. Just a quick question from me. Could you put this a little bit into context, maybe for our British and American listeners? What could this mean for British consumers and for American consumers? I think we've described the sort of theory of it and the loopholes extremely well. You've given us a really good understanding of that. But in practical terms, what might this actually look like for the person, for the ordinary man in the street, if you like?
So it depends on what happens with supply. I mean, in terms of the UK, we are very dependent on energy imports, but not very dependent on Russian imports. So, for example, last year that's 2021, we spent about £500 million on importing Russian fuels. That's now gone to zero as of the summer. So what did we used to buy from Russia? We bought mainly diesel fuel, some jet fuel, and the government here has said we're going to try and get more of that from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, from Norway, and all these other countries are everyone's trying to protect their finances. We're in a cost of living crisis. Governments are trying to find money. So the countries outside Russia are also ramping up production. So in terms of the UK, we are already pivoting or on our way to pivoting, pretty much away from our reliance on Russian oil. However, we are still very exposed to, as we've seen, you probably see that on your own gas and electricity bill. And obviously the government has tried to cap energy bills at an average of £2,500 at least this winter. So as a direct result of these plans, I don't see a massive difference. I mean, energy bills are still going up. I mean, gas prices, this is not a cap on gas imports. They're sort of extremely volatile. It depends on how cold it is. Here in the UK, we like to talk about the weather a lot, but it does depend on the weather and how cold the winter is and how much we have to import, because we're not like France. We don't have a nuclear fleet that helps to keep the lights on. So we do depend not on Russia for energy, but we get a lot of our imports from Norway, etc. In terms of in America, they're much less dependent on energy imports, thanks to Shell largely. So they were importing some Russian refined products, but America also took steps to ban Russian energy when the invasion started.
Well, thanks so much for that, Sue. Is it all right if Dom asks a question?
Go ahead. I would never say no.
Is it all right? I mean, I'm not going to bite.
Sorry, not. You're just next door.
Yeah, exactly. Sue, hi, lovely. Thanks again for doing this. China, there is talk that President Xi might be loosening the COVID restrictions slightly in response to the wave of protests. Now, let's not talk COVID for a moment and the impacts directly on the health side. But if the Chinese economy starts ramping up again over the next few weeks, what impact will that have, or how does that gel with the news today about the oil cap?
Well, China is the world's factory. It still is, and it has an insatiable demand for energy, and Russian crude is some of that. So as Russian imports into the EU have fallen, I think they've fallen from around 2.5 million barrels per day at the start of the year to around half that, or just over half that. Don't quote me on it, but it's around 1.4 million barrels per day as of now. So as the EU has sort of tried to wean itself off Russian oil, it has been shipping, as I said earlier, to China and India and I think Turkey. So they've made up for that drop in demand, ramping up their purchases by about, I think, 1 million extra barrels per day are going to those countries instead. And yeah, if China, if the Chinese economy does open up, if factories demand from abroad requires them to ramp up, then yeah, China will be a bigger customer. I think the last time I was in it, I was talking about some of Russia's ambitions, and it is looking east. All of its projects, its pipelines are being built. They're being built eastwards. They're not being built westwards. So Vladimir Putin wants to build ties with Beijing. And if the Chinese economy ramps up and Russia's selling oil at a discount, even though they might have to pay a bigger cost to get it from Russia to China by sea, though they've got sort of pipelines already in place to get it over the land, then that could be one potential avenue for those Russian barrels of oil that don't have a home anymore.
Thank you. And just one more, if I may. Given the complexity around all economic measures and the ways of getting around sanctions for those that really want to, how effective do you think these kind of measures are when it comes to trying to influence the actions of a war that's happening right here and right now?
Oh, that's a tough one, isn't it, to end with? I think the thing is with the price cap. So in parallel to what's been announced today, the EU has actually banned banned Russian crude oil imports by sea. So there's a price cap on stuff that's, flowing outside. But from today, the EU, unless it's already on its way, it's not accepting crude oil shipments by sea. But even then, it's been quite difficult. I say by sea because there's still some pipelines that send crude oil from Russia into the rest of Europe, mainly to Germany and to Poland, that have not been banned. So, this is a slow process, and it is a slow. Everything is slow. We can't forget that the EU last year relied on Russia for 25% of its crude oil imports. That's a big number, and it's hard to wean off. And as the fighting continues, they're looking for ways to try and cut off Russia from the rest of the world, but while not hurting themselves. I mean, Europe has an energy crisis, and some analysts are saying it's going to be worse next year because Germany, etc. They've done everything they can to and there's been a mild autumn to kind of get their gas storage levels up, make sure that they're prepared for this winter. But a lot of people are saying that next winter is going to be worse because they've got these bans in place now, and the alternative sources of energy. We're all fighting for the same thing, and if you want it, you've got to pony up. So there is a fine balance. And yes, they want to continue to apply pressure on the Kremlin, but it will continue to be that fine balance going forward. And, governments, as we've seen, we're trying to agree the $60 per barrel cap. Everyone's fighting for their own interest. They're fighting for Ukraine, but it's kind of, it's not always been happy families. And I think it's going to continue as the war continues, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much, Sue Chan, for all of that. Dom, can I come back to you? There's just one update I think we should talk about. Let's go first to Arthur Scott-Geddes talked us through some of the diplomatic events of the last few days, the falling out between Paris and Kyiv, and Scholz's intervention. You had some thoughts on them. What are they?
Yeah, I just think it's extremely dangerous to blur the military and the diplomatic. Now, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't try and do both, but I'm just saying you need to be on your absolute A game to do that. And I'm not sure these guys are, especially President Macron. So he's talking about Russia needing security guarantees, which, okay, I see. Kyiv's gone through the roof on this, and I think they're quite right here, because I mean anything that nods towards a moral equivalence of Ukraine and Russia over this conflict is extremely dangerous territory. And if these ideas, the more we start talking about security guarantees for Russia, and then of course there's always going to be that area of comment about, well, it's all NATO's fault for gobbling up all these countries, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard all the arguments before. But anything that suggests that there's a moral equivalence is really, really dodgy ground, I suggest. And if you start talking about security guarantees for Russia, and then it's picked up by someone else, and guess who that's going to be? It's going to be all the Russian sites and Russo-friendly areas talking about security guarantees, blah blah blah. It then becomes a currency, which means that then when you stop talking about it, if you stop talking about security guarantees for Russia, then Russia can say, the West are rowing back on their earlier ideas of security guarantees. So it becomes a thing in and of itself. So you play with these things. You've got to be very, very careful. And I'm not sure Mr. Macron has really thought this through here. His strategy, I don't know what his strategy is, but the way it's being communicated at the moment, I think, is just leaving. He is leaving himself open to huge criticism, political criticism, and he's giving great succor to Putin and Russia. So I think any talk of security guarantees is just ridiculous right now. And secondly, Mr. Scholz, he's saying that we don't want to get into another Cold War. Again, I think you just need to be a bit careful here, because if you blur the lines, but the Cold War was a battle of ideologies, and you could argue that there is an emerging Cold War between the West, if you like, for ease of an expression, and China over how society should be ordered and managed and led, etc., etc. I think that is a far cry from what's happening now against Russia, or the model that Russia is offering the world. I mean, Russia is offering a kind of gangsterism, cronyism, mafia state, however you want to call it, prepared to use terrorism, i.e. violence, for a political end. I mean, it's not a system they're offering. It's just a bunch of tired old men trying to make money. And I think to try and talk about that in terms of a Cold War is wrong, because it equates to systems, and there is not a system. So in that regard, I think Mr. Schultz Chancellor Schultz is correct. There is not a Cold War here with Russia, because it affords them the luxury of saying that what they're doing is a realistic political offer to the people that they can choose or not choose. Of course, they get no choice whatsoever. This thing's lumped on them whether they like it or not. So there is no Cold War there. But the more he says we should not use these terms anymore, I think it pulls the rug from under the intellectual curiosity that would then lead us to think, well, hang on, what do we mean by a Cold War, and what is happening more broadly to power and society in the 21st century vis-a-vis China? Okay, a conversation for another day, but I think that is worth exploring if we think there is a Cold War of ideologies and different system of human organisation between the West and China. But I think by just cutting that conversation off and saying, well, we can't talk about it in terms of Russia, whilst I think that is correct in terms of Russia, I'd be very loath to say that is an outdated notion, and any talk of the Cold War ended in 1989.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you very much, Dom, for bringing that up. There's just one more thing I'd quite like for you to talk about. There's been an update from a US intelligence officer who said that the fighting in Ukraine has fallen to a reduced tempo. Just talk us through that a little bit. Can you give us a lay of the land across the lines at the moment?
Yeah, so these were comments at a security forum over the weekend by Avril Haines, the US Director of National Intelligence, and she was saying that she was basically making the point that the Great Freeze is going to just halt any kind of decisive military move over the winter. I'm not so sure about that, to be perfectly honest. I mean, what the Great Freeze is going to do, for want of stating the blindingly obvious, it's going to freeze the ground. Okay, and once you get more than about a foot of hard frost, then tanks and other heavy vehicles can trundle across that quite happily. I mean, we can get into the debate about wheels versus tracks and which vehicles are better for what type of ground and so on and so forth. It all comes down to ground pressure, and if you divide the weight of the vehicle by the footprint on the ground, which is tanks, you got the whole length of both tracks, which is a much bigger distance than the footprint of wheels. So tanks can get across much worse ground, boggy ground, muddy ground, than wheels can. Wheels, or modern variable pressure systems, you can basically increase the size of the wheel on the ground by reduce the pressure of the tyre, so it's a bit more squidgy and sort of spreads out across the ground. So you lower the pressure of the wheels basically, so it can get across better ground. Now, a lot of these ideas came in Afghanistan about having wheeled vehicles that are generally lower to maintain. They're not as needy as tracks, but they themselves, they obviously need a lot of maintenance. But there's this perennial debate about wheels and tracks. But the point I'm making is that I think if you look at what's been gifted to Ukraine over the last few months, the US alone has gifted hundreds of Humvees, the crikey, help me out here, guys. High mobility wheeled vehicles. I'm missing an M. There's another M in there somewhere. High mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles. Anyway, the big jeepy things that we see around and about. Hundreds of those have been donated. Each drawdown that President Biden authorises, there's about 100 or 150, 125. I mean, it's triple figures each time. So Ukraine have been gifted hundreds of these very, very capable vehicles, very versatile vehicles. And I just wonder if what they are doing, or what they are shaping up for, is to build a force that is able to rapidly exploit success. So as we saw up in the Kharkiv region back in September, when if you're able to break through that crust of Russian defences, then you can run right behind it. The ground, if it's big and open country, and in the winter if it's nice and hard and frozen, then you can drive many long distances, and you're only limited by your risk appetite and the geography. So I just wonder if Ukraine is building up that kind of doctrine, being able to rapidly exploit success, particularly with, I don't mean to draw it all down to one piece of equipment like the Humvees, but there's a lot more to it than that. But I just think Avril Haines might be a little bit quick out the blocks to say that everything's going to freeze. I mean, it will literally freeze over the winter, but the battle lines will freeze. I mean, the front line is huge. Russia does not have the personnel or the equipment, does not have the capability to put a big trench system all the way along. They are digging trenches, as we know, anti-tank and other trench systems. But I mean, that's a thin crust. And I think if Ukraine are able to get through there, then the ground is going to lend itself, physically lend itself to manoeuvre when it gets really, really cold. Of course, with extremely low temperatures, you've then got the impact on petrol, oil, lubricants. You've got the impact on the men and women actually in the things, and so on and so forth. So it's not the be all and end all. But I just think equating this down to sort of geology and saying it's going to be so cold they won't do anything is a little bit premature. Just want to keep an eye out for that.
Thanks, Dom. Just one more. We've got a question from a listener for you, and then we'll go to our final thoughts from you and Suchan. This is a question from James, and I think it relates to your earlier points about these explosions at Russian air bases deep inside Russia. James asks, could Russia's size and number of military bases and military reserves count against them? Ukraine could be in a very target-rich time with Russia, unable to protect even a fraction of its infrastructure. Its size would count against it. I mean, I think this kind of rolls on actually from what you were just saying. So would you like to take that?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. I mean, I think that's probably accurate in as much as the greater the target environment, the more stuff you can hit. But you've got to be very, very careful about extrapolating that to we just fire these things anyway and we'll hit something of value. I mean, no, you won't always hit something of great value. You have to be very selective in your targeting. Think about what effect do you want to achieve, and therefore what's the target that's best placed to go for to achieve that end. And then you've got to do what's called weapon to target matching, i.e. make sure you've got the right munition, the right weapon to go and hit the thing you want to do. So you might identify that there's a fantastic headquarters or a great air defence site or an electronic warfare site or a logistics depot, a fuel dump, an arms cache, whatever it is. But where it is and the defences around it means you might not be able to use the weapon you want. You've got to use something else. You might not have so many of those other things. There might be other targets of higher priority for those missiles, or you'd be unwise to just scattergun your munitions across the front. You need to. One of the British 10 principles of war is concentration of force. So you need to kind of bring your military capability together at a time and place of your choosing. That way you've got a much higher chance of success of punching through and achieving the aim you want, just sort of going for it. There's a time and a place, of course, when the blood is up, and you just need to kind of get off your belt buckle and run at them. But just going for it is a very, very quick way of expending all your ammunition, and especially the very sophisticated weapons. They'll be depleted very, very quickly, and you might do that for marginal gain. So yes, a much greater attack surface because Russia is a bigger thing to hit and a bigger armed force there to aim at. But I think Ukraine would still be, as I think they are, being very, very cautious about what they hit when, sequencing that with other actions to try and keep some sort of momentum, and in order to have have an operational or a strategic effect rather than just the low level tactical effect of blowing stuff up. But no, I think you're right. There is a much bigger attack surface, so they can choose if their intelligence is good enough to identify all these nodes and all these bits of critical equipment. Then yes, they are able to select from a much broader list. Of course, it works the other way as well. If you are much smaller, then you have to arguably put a greater proportion of your force into protecting what you've got. So it is all swings and roundabouts, but inherently not incorrect in your assumption.
Well, thank you, James, for the question, and thank you, Dom, for your answer there. I think we've come to the end of our time together today. So can I just go to both of you for your final thoughts? What will you be looking at over the next few days or even few weeks when it comes to some of the economic things we've been discussing today? Su-Chan, would you just sum up what you've been talking about today and let us know what you're thinking, what you're looking at over the next week?
Sure, I'll try and keep it short. I think anyone listening over their lunchtime, thanks for sticking with us. Probably right at the corner of your sandwich or the last few bites of last night's dinner. But I mean, today, the things that are coming into effect today are the biggest tranche of sanctions on Russian oil we've seen to date. They're designed to hurt Russia where it hurts most, in the pocket, but keep the oil flowing around the world. Whether it's going to work or not is another question. I mean, there's a big question over, will a non-European insurance market emerge from this? Can anyone do this? Is anyone prepared to insure these tankers? And at what price? And will tanker owners play ball with these sanctions? That's also an open question. And, how effective will this cap be? I mean, policymakers said, it's designed to be reviewed. So the price cap will always be below the going rate on the market. But there are a lot of unanswered questions. I mean, this will hurt the Russian economy, as sanctions have done. But whether it will make a massive difference in terms of, boots on the ground or Russia's offensive. I mean, if you go by what the spokesman said this morning, they said it categorically won't. But then, let's talk soon.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sue, for your time today. It's really great to have you back on. Dom Nichols, your final thoughts, please.
I've been watching over the weekend a visit by Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defence minister, to his opposite number in Belarus, Viktor Krenin. He went over on Saturday, Sergei Shoigu. Now, we're not entirely sure what they're up to. They apparently signed some updates to a security treaty from 1997. He then went and met Lukashenko. Now, we talked about Belarus recently. Belarus hosts Russian troops. We think they're doing training there. We think they launched. Well, we know they launched into the north of Ukraine from Belarus. We think a lot of aircraft are taking off from Belarus and missiles fired from there. But we also think that Lukashenko is trying to play trying to limit his involvement, limit his support, and certainly limit the Belarusian armed forces being subsumed by Russia and starting a war or launching their own attack into Ukraine. So, quite what they're doing, we're not sure. Ukraine have had to apportion capabilities to the north of the country in case of this. That's a sensible thing to do. Now, and all the joint training that's been going on for months now in Belarus has been fairly low level, we think, sort of at company sized, if not smaller, so nothing too big. But the more that Belarus is drawn into this, the greater a headache that's going to be for Kyiv if there's arguably another front or another few thousand troops from that then are pushed against them. So just want to keep an eye on what's happening in Belarus and see if we get any more information about quite what Sergei Shoigu was doing there at the weekend. And just finally an update on the attacks that have been going on, the air raids have been going on since we've been talking. There are unconfirmed reports, and I reiterate the unconfirmed nature of that. Do seek information elsewhere. Unconfirmed reports of cruise missile launches from the Caspian Sea and also from the Black Sea Fleet, and other dozens of air-launched cruise missiles, which may come from the long-range bombers, as mentioned at the start, but may also have come from the Black Sea Fleet. But it looks as if there's a large attack ongoing across the entire country of Ukraine as we speak.
Thank you to Arthur, Dom and Sue for that. We now have a short interview with our global health reporter Harriet Barber. Last week, Harriet attended an international conference on sexual violence in war. Just a note to our listeners, this interview contains graphic descriptions of sexual violence that some listeners might find triggering and disturbing. So, Harriet, you were at a major international conference for preventing sexual violence in conflict. It was in London last week. Dozens of survivors from around the world spoke out about their abuse. Looking at Ukraine in particular, what did you learn about the last 9 months?
The conference was hosted by James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary. Guests from 40 countries came, including the First Lady of Ukraine. James Cleverly described an alarming number of reports of sexual violence in the last 9 months, but there was also quite a lot of talk about abuse that happened in 2014 as well. The UN has started to document that. Sexual violence in conflict has long been used as a tactic of war, torture, terrorism and repression, and it's used against men, women and children. It's currently happening in, they think, about 18 active conflicts around the world, including Syria, South Sudan. What was talked about in terms of Ukraine, since the full-scale invasion, there's been horrendous reports of people being forced to parade naked in the streets, women being gang raped, men being castrated. There was also one really awful report of a 4-year-old child being forced to give oral sex.
You write about how the UN say the known reports are just the tip of the iceberg. That's the quote, the tip of the iceberg. What do you mean by that?
So it can take years, even decades, for people to come to terms with their abuse and speak openly about it. In Bosnia, where women were raped in the conflict 30 years ago, some are only now starting to tell their stories. Survivors talk about feeling shame, not wanting to re-traumatize their families, and men also often don't talk about sexual assault, they instead speak about torture.
The sexual violence used in Ukraine was described as, again, this is a quote, systematic. Can you talk us through why the UN has come to that conclusion? Because that's something more than, or something different to potentially random acts of violence. What does systematic mean in this context?
Yeah. So Reuters news agency recently reported that some Russian commanders have encouraged and ordered sexual violence, which appears to show planning of the abuse on a more systematic level. People who I spoke to who were working on the ground helping sexual abuse victims spoke about there being 2 methods to the sexual violence in this conflict. So the first is staged during an attack on a village and involves dragging people out on the streets, parading them. Women often face sexual violence afterwards in their homes. There were lots of reports of elderly women being abused in this way. And the second pattern of abuse happens in the detention centres in occupied territories. It's been hard to document this because people are still captive, but those who have fled or been liberated have spoke of sexual torture, particularly against men, in the form of genital electrocution and castration. The on-the-ground teams have also said that compared to 2014, there's now an added element of hate speech accompanying these crimes. So there were reports of pregnant women being beaten and being told that there's nothing bad about a small, dirty Ukrainian dying, for example. And there's also been more reports of attacks being perpetrated in front of family members, which sort of speaks to the tactic of destroying communities and neighbourhoods.
Many survivors spoke at this conference. What did you hear from them?
They really did want to speak out. They've called for a much tougher international response. The first prosecution for rape as a war crime didn't happen until 1998, but since then it still doesn't happen all that often. It can take decades to hold people to account, and generally you can count on your hand the amount of successful convictions there have been. So there's calls for better justice systems, calls for sanctions on individuals and states, much in the same ways that Russia's assets have been sanctioned. But there was also a lot of frustration. Survivors said that they've heard these promises for years and years, and governments talk about trying to fix the problem, and it doesn't really seem to be happening.
Thank you very much, Harriet, for that.
Thanks for having me.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app. Check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. And today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.